John F. Kennedy Junior Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Leo Jardén. I'm a senior at the college studying economics and government and a member of the JFK Junior Forum Committee. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located both on the park side and the JFK street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please now also take a moment to silence your phones and join me in welcoming Harvard College undergraduate Mira Sholovar. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the John F. Kennedy Junior Forum here at the Institute of Politics. My name is Mira Sholovar. I'm a first year at the college and a member of the JFK Junior Forum Committee. The future of U.S. international aid, economic development, and global infrastructure is currently hanging in the balance. Today's conversation comes at an important moment when policymakers are considering the future of the U.S. foreign assistance architecture in the wake of drastic cuts to USAID, the world's largest foreign aid agency. In today's forum, we are fortunate to have with us former senior officials who led U.S. development agencies, including USAID, the Development Finance Corporation, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and who worked in both the House and Senate on foreign aid oversight. Our first speaker is Nisha Biswal, former Deputy CEO of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. Biswal served as an Assistant Administrator for Asia at the U.S. Agency for International Development, overseeing U.S. development assistance programs and policies for the Asia-Pacific region. Next, Paul Foldi is the Professional Services Council's Vice President for International Development Affairs, where he serves as lead for the Council of International Development Companies, focused on the U.S. Agency for International Development and the Department of State. Jonathan Nash serves as the President and CEO of Bluemont, a global nonprofit dedicated to driving innovation and digital transformation. Prior to joining Bluemont, Jonathan served as the acting CEO at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, a U.S. government agency focused on alleviating global poverty through economic growth. This conversation will be moderated by Fatima Sumar, the Executive Director of the Harvard Center for International Development and an adjunct lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she teaches policy design and development diplomacy. Today's forum event is the sixth part of the Harvard Center for International Development Spotlight Series on the future of U.S. foreign aid. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speaker and moderator to the stage.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to see all of you. So, anyone here been reading newspaper headlines? Yeah, Kevin has. Look, I know there's been a lot in the news right now in the last 8 weeks or so with what's happening with USAID. As you heard, the world's largest foreign aid agency, it represented about 1/3 of the entire allocation for the official development assistance account for the world. So a significant portion of global leadership really did sit in Washington under USAID. There's been a lot of news in terms of what the cuts have meant, both for the agency itself, for staff, for those that work with the agency in over 100 countries around the world. So in today's conversation, I'm really thrilled because this is like, we're going to almost pretend that none of you are here, and we're back in our DC offices, because we all worked together back in the day, in different positions, both when we were in the Senate, when people were working with the White House, the State Department, and our development aid agencies. And so we want to have a really candid, frank conversation with all of you about how do we assess this moment in time? What do we think about it? Where do we think we're going? And what does it mean for all of you? Does that work? All right, we're going to jump right in. I'm happy to see all of you. So I want us to start with the current landscape today. So when we think about the last 8 weeks, I can't believe it's only been the last 8 weeks because it feels like the news is coming so fast and furious with us. When we think about the last 8 weeks, overnight it feels like without a lot of policy planning, strategic forethought, we have dismantled the world's largest aid agency. Lots of people have been fired, furloughed, lots of different consequences, including for our implementing partners, which we want to talk about. just to get us in, just to kick off the conversation first, is this a global crisis moment in development, or is this kind of a very narrow lens because we're sitting here in the US and we're obsessed with what's happening with Washington? And I want to just preface that by saying that we're seeing similar cuts take place for different political reasons in other countries. The UK, France, Sweden, Switzerland, Germany may be considering different types of allocations after its elections. So there's a lot changing in many different countries' political systems right now, not just in the US. Is this a watershed moment in how we think about international development when the history books write this moment? Or is this kind of, there's some changes, the dust will settle, and life will go on? How do you view this moment in terms of a big landscape moment right now first? Jonathan, we'd love to start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I see this as a watershed moment. Everything has changed. What has happened over the last 8 weeks has been chaotic, and it's been absolutely destructive. And we could talk about, is this just something that folks are worried about in the US or in Washington, D.C.? I say no. All the people who are relying on support from USAID and State Department funded programs are now going without. You see that particularly on the health side. So this is having global impact. So we could talk about the 10,000 people at USAID who were furloughed, and that's unfortunate. But tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people have lost their jobs abroad, and these were folks who were providing life-saving, life-supporting assistance to a variety of communities. So this has major ripple effects. We may just focus in on what's happening in the US or this little slice of the international development community, but in my mind, this is global, and we are seeing other governments pull back on their commitments to funding. This has almost given some of them, I think, my personal view, cover to do so.
Nisha.
So, I think I have a slightly different nuance that I view this moment. Yes, it is a moment of acute disruption and perhaps accelerated change, but it is change that we have been seeing for some time, which is that we've known for some time that public sector finance was not keeping pace with global need, that the poly-crisis environment in which we've been operating, that USAID and other development institutions were not able to really bring the resources necessary to try to address both the crises and kind of the development goals and objectives of countries around the world, and that other resources were going to need to be leveraged. And we were hearing this 2, 3, 5 years ago about the need to really think about that development paradigm. Now, the way in which this acute disruption is happening feels a bit like needlessly destructive in terms of both the institutional destruction that is happening, the impact that it is having in the industry, in the sector, but also in terms of partners and allies, in terms of the countries and the recipients, the most vulnerable populations. So yes, on the one hand, it feels like this is a consequential and watershed moment, but I think it is an acceleration of a journey that we've been on for some time, and perhaps we can think about what can come kind of next on this journey that will perhaps fill some of the gaps that are being created right now.
Paul?
Terrific. Thanks so much, and thanks for hosting this into the Institute of Politics. It's great to be here. I work for an organization called the Professional Services Council. We'll get into what that is. It's a trade association, but in Washington, you always know to say, I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not behalf of my organization. My concern is that, are we going to get to an inflection point where yet another aspect of America becomes a partisan issue, where, given the responses that we've currently seen on the Hill, will foreign assistance, which apparently now we call international assistance, become a Democratic issue? And the Republicans want to shy away from it, and will we begin to see this pendulum swing? And if that becomes the case, then what I think it's going to be even a greater concern to our partners and allies overseas regarding the longevity of the relationship with the United States. Oh, it's a Republican administration, they're going to do this. Oh, it's a Democratic administration, they're going to do that. And that pendulum swing is never good for foreign policy, given the decades-long bipartisanship that this subject has always seemed to have had, whether it's in the National Endowment for Democracy, with IRI and NDI. I'm just very concerned that we might be at that point, but I'm hoping we're not.
When we were on the Hill, it was the axiom that politics stops at the water's edge. I don't know that that edge exists anymore. On the other hand, I think maybe we all need to resist the temptation to ascribe it as purely kind of a partisan and look for commonalities, because a lot of the initiatives that have formed development assistance have been born out of Republican administrations, whether you're talking about PEPFAR, MCC, DFC, et cetera. So I think we have to try to perhaps stop ourselves from looking at it through a partisan lens.
I hope you're right. I just point of fact that PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, actually expires officially today, in spite of the fact that it had been reauthorized for long periods of time. And I think that's one of the issues that is currently being caught in that trap, if you will. And I just think we're going to need to some dramatic reassessments. So.
You know, but just to give some historical context, so you know, if we go back a decade ago, we all worked in very different capacities. But on the Hill, for instance, you know, Paul, you and I worked together on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. You worked on the Republican side, I worked on the Democratic side. We worked together. We worked together on foreign aid, we worked together on foreign policy. We didn't always agree. We had different points of view. Our members had different points of view. The committee could be very divided on where Republican and the Democratic caucuses were. But we were able to work together to figure out how to support what we thought were American priorities when it came to foreign policy, when it came to national security, when we came to international development. That feels different today. Is that a fair read from how you see it?
I'm not on the Hill, but I work with the Hill, so I think it's fair to say that the staffs continue to work together pretty collegially, and then the question becomes, when does big P politics begin to interfere as we try to do that word compromise on so many of these issues that's vital to moving forward? And I think we're going to see that we're at loggerheads right now, and the PEPFAR situation is a perfect example for that, so yes. So
there was a memo last week, or a policy proposal that was put out there. Some of you may have seen it. Anonymous. Maybe it was leaked. We don't know, but it's all over mainstream media sources. I'm going to summarize a little bit about what that policy proposal said, and I'd love your reactions to it. So we're about 8 weeks in from the steps about dismantling USAID. The proposal, and we don't know who it's written, so the authorship is unclear. We have some guesses, but we don't know yet who the authors are in this. It has not yet been formally endorsed by the administration or by Secretary Rubio. The proposal, though, calls for taking American foreign assistance and coming up with a new architecture. This architecture would focus on America, three different pillars: for it to be safer, to be stronger, and more prosperous. And in each of those buckets, it has a tripartite reorientation. So on the first bucket, it would basically absorb what's remaining of USAID, particularly around humanitarian, disaster, food security, and global health and global health relief. And they would absorb that into the State Department. And that would get run out of largely the regional offices where Nisha and I used to work, on the regional side of the State Department. The second pillar would make America safer by focusing on what they call political issues of the administration, things like democracy, interestingly, civil rights, and women's empowerment made that list as well, alongside religious freedom. And that would also be run out of the State Department, more from the technical bureau's side. And then the third would make America more prosperous, and it would really focus on trade, investment, energy, and infrastructure. And that would take the Development Finance Corporation, where Nisha just worked, which was created under the BUILD Act in 2018 under the administration, and really supersize, plus up DFC. It would integrate the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a smaller development agency, Jonathan, where you and I worked, put that under DFC. It would take another one of our aid agencies in the US, the US Trade Development Authority, put that under DFC, and focus really on the economic growth engine part of the equation. So you're seeing a proposal out there that would basically streamline the bureaucracy. So it would not get rid of development assistance, it wouldn't get rid of humanitarian assistance, but it would really reconfigure what this looks like. So humanitarian and democratic political considerations within the State Department and economic growth within DFC. There have been a wide variety of reactions to this proposal that's out there. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts.
Alleged proposal.
Alleged proposal, all right, we can caveat it, yes. There's been a wide variety of reactions, including some people love it, saying it's really a smart way to realign bureaucracy. It's smarter, it's cheaper. It would make us, the United States, more competitive against China, particularly the Belt Road Initiative and other infrastructure on the economic growth sides. Others say there's no workforce that could do any of this since you just got rid of the whole workforce, and you can't just reorg things on paper. You have to think about who and who's going to be doing this and who's trained to do this, and that's very difficult to do when you just fired 10,000 plus workers. What are your thoughts? What are your reactions?
I mean, you know, if you're trying to be a good change manager, you come up with a proposal first, you shop it around, get input, and then you make the changes. What's happened here is they've blown up USAID. People have left, so all the expertise that you would need to make this new, arrangement work are gone, may or may not come back. We've lost trust with a lot of our partners in country, which I think will also undercut our ability to implement this new model. The new model has, in my personal view, has a lot of merits, a lot of good ideas, some of which have been in works for years. But the scale and scope of this change at this point, given what has happened over the last 8 weeks, to me, I have a lot of doubt that it will actually be put into action or elements of it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Jonathan said. I mean, I think the execution is the hard part, right? As a frame of trying to explain both internally to the American people and externally to our partners and stakeholders around the world, creating these kind of key pillars of safer, stronger, and more prosperous isn't easy to understand way of looking at kind of the baskets. It's a bit reductive in that it doesn't create the more comprehensive, nuanced, all-encompassing frame that USAID would go in and try to create that looked at issues and challenges individually and create strategies around that. It's essentially trying to make a comprehensible framework that you can message to the American people. And let's be frank here. One of the reasons why we are in the situation we are in is that we have been very focused on how we think about and message development to our constituencies around the world, and less so to the individuals who are, at the end of the day, financing that, and that's the American people and the American taxpayer. And so one of the things that was apparent to me in the way that this was constructed is that this is essentially trying to create a message frame that resonates at home as much as it does anywhere else. How you put it into practice, the details, the devil is in the details, as they say. And I think if you lose too much capacity and knowledge and funding and data sets, et cetera, then I think it's really hard to even along these pillars to recreate it. So I think that that's a challenge that they need to be careful of. On the other hand, thinking about it in these pillars and then thinking about kind of the economic pillar, the more prosperous, in a way that links American prosperity to how we also engage globally is a smart way of trying to connect that.
So a couple of things. I want to give a shout out to a good colleague of mine, Dan Rundy from CSIS in Washington, D.C. The reason is many years ago, the State Department absorbed the U.S. Information Agency, USIA, And all we do now is lament the state of our public diplomacy, which is what USAID did. And the fear is that if we absorb, this is my philosophy on this, if USAID is absorbed by the State Department, we're 10 years, 20 years from now, we're going to be in that same boat where we're lamenting the lack of independence of that nature to do that programmatic activity. And I think that's going to be a huge thing. And I also, I don't know if you all remember New Coke when that came out, and that lasted for 6 months, and they thought, what were we thinking? Why you would take USAID, which has one of the strongest brands out there, the hand clasp from the American people. I'm at a loss. I'm truly at a loss. And then finally, to get really wonky, for any of you who had looked at that memo with the little call-out boxes and the graphics, the State Department never does that. They just type stuff. So I don't know where this actually came from, but absent, normally you'll see on one of these memos, you'll have a signature page where it's drafted by and then it's cleared by. So we don't know who actually wrote it. We have no idea. We don't know the veracity to it. It tracks with a lot of what the administration has been saying, but we're waiting for somebody to disown it, I think, as much as we are waiting for somebody to own it. But from my perspective, I was fascinated with this because to me, if they were going to go for cost savings, I'll be controversial, they would have taken MCC, DFC, and all those and brought those under USAID and then begun to eliminate sort of the C-suite levels of those agencies, and then allow that to be more of the international development architecture and ecosystem. I hate that word, but that's what they call it. That's what I would have been anticipating with this administration. So when I saw the crane up there chiseling off the letters, no one had that in their bingo card. I promise you, nobody. That was.
Yeah.
Paul mentioned that, if USAID gets absorbed by state, I think many of us who are implementing partners out there doing the work who had USAID contracts or still have some contracts with whatever USAID now is, we're assuming USAID's gone, despite, the ongoing court cases and the judge's orders to reinstate USAID. We just don't believe that's going to happen. So we've moved on. It's never going to be like it was before, so we're adapting and trying to figure out what we're going to do. And we see state as being our primary client at this point, with a smattering of former USAID folks brought into state to help execute payments on old USAID contracts. But I don't know, maybe you have a different view. But
so what I would say is I know that many in the audience are interested in, do I want to go into this field? So it's an interesting thing. So again, we're a trade association of the for-profit companies that work with around the federal government. I just happen to concentrate on those that work with USAID and the Department of State. And those that are mono-focused on USAID are, in 6 months, the playing field will be dramatically leveled, and this complaint that the same companies keep winning the awards, which we can absolutely talk about why that is, it's going to be even more concentrated on that front. And so if they haven't diversified, for those of you in the business school, they're going to be in a world of hurt. And we should talk about as well the differences between NGOs and for-profits on how they're structured, et cetera, et cetera.
All right, so I want to be a little provocative for a second.
Oh, please.
Because, one of the things, we're a policy school here, and one of the things we have to think about as we have all these challenges right now, we have some big global challenges we're trying to figure out, and we've got to move fast in some ways. All of us have served across different administrations in different capacities. It is striking to me that change happens in Republican administrations when it comes to development. And it does not feel as dramatic under Democratic administrations, from my point of view. I'm thinking about George Bush, and I'm thinking about PEPFAR. I'm thinking about the creation of MCC. I'm thinking about Trump 1, the BUILD Act. That was a really significant piece of legislation in 2018 that created and gave birth to DFC. Whatever comes out in Trump 2 on this will be significant, with whatever that looks like, whatever shape it takes. When we've had Democratic-led leadership, I have worked for them, some of you have worked for them, we tend to be very consultative. We tend to do all the steps of the policy design process, Jonathan, you laid out. We tend to get stuck, to be honest, and we don't make a lot of those dramatic types of changes. I wanted to ask a little bit, some of the changes we're seeing, when you think about both existing big donor countries, you think about China's BRI initiative, but you think about new countries that could be emerging, whether it's Saudi or others in the Gulf. You think about other actors that are watching this landscape right now. in a way, our architecture is very subdivided. We talk about USAID. Many people are surprised to know we have over 20 development agencies in the United States architecture. I bet half our audience, even our development experts, couldn't name more than 10 of those out of the 20 of those agencies. They've been very disparate. A lot of them have been closed down in the last 8 weeks, not just USAID. This idea to consolidate, to streamline bureaucracy, and then to develop a new type of workforce that would be agile, that wouldn't be the paper pushers of Paul's point, Paul's words, not mine, on that, but to think about how to do some of this work in very different, agile ways. Jonathan, you run one of the largest humanitarian NGOs today. I know in conversations I've had with you, you're thinking about reconstruction of Syria, Yemen, Gaza. These are huge whole-scale problems, and yet a lot of your time gets stuck in a lot of bureaucraties of how to win a contract, right? What is your reaction to this idea that sometimes to kind of think big, to create differently, to be competitive on a global stage with other countries that are willing to make big bets? This is a big bet from the Trump administration, and that they could create lots of different types of opportunities. I'd love any reactions to that.
So, having worked in multiple Democratic administrations, I would say that there's a really strong fidelity to process and to ensuring that there's a very consultative way of engaging to make sure that we're not acting in a way that's going to disempower or disenfranchise a key aspect. And so in the process of being that focused on having a good process, we sometimes, I think, don't drive as hard towards the outcome as we should. And I'm just being very candid here, right? On the other hand, we've seen, certainly in the current administration, sometimes such a focus on the outcome that you run a process that is really sloppy or inadequate or lacking, and that's also not necessarily the right place to be. Yes, the BUILD Act and DFC, for example, was created during the first Trump administration, but it actually took shape during the Biden administration. It was the Biden administration that had the opportunity to come in and actually build it, create the organization, create the policies, and scale it to the point where, we were doing, I think in the last year of the Biden administration, $12 billion in financing in 1 year across over 200 projects, right? So just a massive and rapid scale up. So it's not to say that Democrats can't build. It's just that we're extremely methodical and process-oriented in a way that perhaps I haven't seen as much focus on in at least the current administration.
So Fatima, I'd like to grab onto what you were saying regarding other countries and their activities. And one of the reasons that I, as a student of American foreign policy and former practitioner, am so concerned by the recent activities is that we are opening up so much to our adversaries by pulling back. And that's the thing that I find particularly confusing, particularly in this memo, the veracity of which we continue to debate. They mention China, China, China. Well, if we continue to scale back our activities, and we've seen it, there was a Cambodian demining program where the Chinese simply said, perfect, we'll pay for that. And that is my greatest concern, is that the power projection that these programs afford our country are being reduced significantly, while the foreign policy aspirations and pronouncements of the administration have not been. It's the great disconnect between the two. Was it Madeleine Albright used to say, we're no longer going to do more with less. I think there needs to be a recognition as well that we're not going to be able to do that. And now there's this talk, universality is when we have an embassy in every single country. Now they're talking about doing away with universality. Of course it costs, but it's power projection, and that's what big countries do. They project their power, they're important, that's why they're there. And again, I'm just confused by this.
Okay, so I want to zoom out. I want to go back to the global stage for a second. So And I want to talk a little bit more about development as a sector and development where we are today versus where we were 80 years ago when we created this more global architecture, including USAID in the 1960s. So look, back then, and many of you know this because we studied here at the Kennedy School, back then, roughly 60% of the world lived in extreme poverty, 2 world wars, this entire devastation in Europe, Japan, the Great Depression here and many other countries. You saw massive devastation, a massive effort to rebuild this entire architecture that you are all familiar with that emerges from that. The Bretton Woods, the UN, the World Bank, multilats, bilats, and foundations that come with. But the world has changed a lot since then, and thanks to the rise of India, thanks to the rise of China, many other middle-income countries, we're in a fundamentally different shape and place. I want to go back to our first question, is this a crossroads moment? And so we can have, I think many of us, we've talked and we've had many of these conversations of this emotional reaction for the last 8 weeks, but let's step away from that around, is this a moment to build new architecture in the development landscape to help think differently for the new world that we're inheriting right now, whether that's climate, whether that's inequality, whether it's going to be AI and where all the resources are going to come from in order to build and sustain AI. The development sector has changed a lot. Is the US in some ways actually it's been the largest donor, so it has status quo. You have power from being a status quo funder in some spaces and ways. Is it an exciting time for the rest of the world in some ways? Are there new opportunities for the rest of the world to engage more, to engage differently? You and I were talking about other donors that could come online that are not the traditional 5 donors that you're always knocking on doors with. Is there a moment here for the rest of the world where we can think differently?
I think it's an emphatic yes, but it's at a cost, right? So I think the world will and is already moving to reshape around a new order that has not one major pole in the tent. If the US is not the long pole in the tent, other poles will emerge and more shifting alliances and roles will happen. We have talked for decades about more burden sharing. I think this is going to rapidly create a world in which there is more burden sharing as other actors step up. You're seeing it in the security space with the Europeans starting to really scale up in defense spending and industrialization. So on the one hand, will it have the desired outcome of having greater burden sharing? Yes. What is the cost? The cost is going to be at the cost of American influence, right? Like, because we were the long pole in the tent, the world was building its architecture around us and accommodative to us. And in a world where we're not the long pole, it's not going to be as accommodative to the United States. And I think that's the fundamental kind of tension and balance that's going to be struck here.
I agree 100%. I think also the loss here is what everybody who was relying upon these programs that were supported by the U.S. government, what they're going to do for the next 6 months, year, 2, 3 years before somebody else steps in or there's another service. So I 100% agree. And maybe just putting it back to boots on the ground. What do you tell the Ministry of Health in Uganda, who was relying upon all this funding for health, and they have to shutter these clinics? And well, let's hope a European funder comes by, or let's hope maybe we can get a public-private partnership in here. So it's this gap period, and I think you'd be hard pressed to find anybody in the development sector who said everything was going fine. We didn't need any reform. I think everybody knew and had been for many years. We need reform. It needs to be more efficient. USAID was funding stuff it probably shouldn't have had localization. So this accelerates it all. And to quote the president, I think we could have used a scalpel rather than a hatchet. And as we use the scalpel, then kind of figure out what that transition period looks like in a consultative way. But this is kind of zero-based budgeting. It's just cut it all down, burn it down, and then add the pieces back later. But in the interim period, you have a lot of people who are going to go through a lot of pain and suffering as a result.
Absolutely. A lot of needless destruction that could have been avoided and achieve that outcome in a different way.
Again, for an administration that wants to make America great again, I think as an American, we should be that long pole in the tent. I don't think this is going to allow us to be that. again, because that we will be viewed as turning on a dime, turning things off needlessly. There's no question that the E in PEPFAR, it's not an emergency if it's been running for more than 20 years. We need to sit down with the countries and say, we're going to have to gradually cut this down, but to cut it all at once, I think, is going to be disastrous for our foreign policy. You all probably are aware in Congress that's mandated. It's the UN voting report. Remember this? So there's a report that says, how do countries vote with us in the UN? And the theory behind it was that we were going to reward our friends and punish those people who didn't vote for us. It was never used. I'm curious to see if this administration will use it. I'm not telling them something they don't know. It's out there. It's always out there. It gets published every year. We'll have to see if that's the transactional nature that we end up becoming. I do want to go back to one thing. My good friend Liz Schreier from the U.S. Global Leadership Council likes to remind everyone, if you ask Americans, are we giving money to foreigners? Oh my God, yes, it's too much. How much are we giving them? I don't know, 20% of the budget, and you tell them it's less than 1%, and they go, oh, well, no, we should give that. So that disconnect, again, this is all about disconnects, and the lack of transparency in the way things were done, I think, is just going to harm us.
Yeah, look, I think no one's going to argue against, there's been wholesale destruction. I don't think anyone's debating the wholesale destruction. I mean, we're talking about livelihoods. The number I saw yesterday is 160,000 jobs already have been lost. That will continue to climb because it's an entire supply chain, frankly, that came from USAID. So, I think massive wholesale destruction. I subscribe to the points of scalpels versus hatchets. Jonathan, to your point. Let me switch gears because we've got a couple minutes before, and I'm gonna just say, if you want to line up, we're gonna take questions in about 10 minutes or so. So if you want to line up, there's 4 mics here. Let me switch. I want to do 2 more buckets before we get to student questions. Let's talk about development finance for a moment, because we have you guys are steeped in development finance from the work that you've each been leading and thinking about. So if we go back to the proposal on the table, official, unofficial, we don't know, but let's go with it because it's something to talk about what an architecture could look like. Humanitarian in the State Department, but all the economic growth, looking at private sector investment, looking at development finance would sit in this other arm of the DFC, with MCC, with USTDA in it. That's where a lot of potential deals could take place for crowding in the private sector. I'd love your thoughts around both, Nisha, maybe I'll start with you on the DFC side, and then Jonathan, we'd love for you to come in, and then Paul on the Hill side of this as well. So from a DFC perspective, you're really looking at both financial returns, you're looking at societal impact, right, in how you make those deals and how you make those decisions. You're looking at a risk portfolio of which countries, both low income, low middle income countries, where you can crowd that growth in. How do you view the opportunities for DFC in this space on crowding in private sector investment? I thought it was very telling that the beneficiary analysis seems to be moving from communities and poor communities to US companies and US jobs of that metric of who would get and who would win, so to speak, on that. Jonathan, from the MCC side, so there's in that proposal, memo, whatever we want to call it, MCC would get consolidated and get expanded. You ran MCC for a period of time. Does that model work? It talks a lot about using a very rigid 5-year country model, which you and I both worked on, which can have tremendous returns, but is not an agile model as you think about it, and only works in select country contexts, right? Is that something that is ready to scale up and ready to go? And what does that mean for a lot of countries that would fall into the gaps? Particularly, I'm thinking in West Africa. I'm thinking a lot of sub-Saharan countries where you don't have risk insurance, you're still in low income status. MCC is not able to work there. In many cases, DFC may not be able to work there today. Maybe that changes with this. What's the opportunities and the trade-offs here about this type of model from a private sector perspective?
Sure. So, DFC in the way in which we're currently set up, and it remains to be seen exactly what the details are of how they would alter DFC, and it's up for reauthorization this year. So there's an opportunity to really think intentionally about how to focus it and what the authorities and scope and scale should be. But the way that it's currently set up, it actually, I think, allows for the flexibility and the breadth of financing that allows you to do both kind of highly bankable, large projects in, lower middle income countries where you can, do highly strategic port projects, et cetera, and yet at the same time be able to look at some of the countries that are perhaps a higher risk profile. We did a couple of very big infrastructure projects in Sierra Leone, a power plant and an airport, right? But because you're spreading that risk across an entire portfolio, you're able to go into higher risk because it's offset by what you're doing in, say, an India or an Indonesia, right? And so that allows DFC to have much more broad base. And I hope that they retain that, because that's really where you can both have the returns and minimize the risk, the financial risk to the American taxpayer, but at the same time create that broader impact, right? And then the other thing is, in addition to infrastructure and energy and critical minerals, one of the things that actually sets the U.S. Apart from the way that perhaps our strategic competitors do in the in the Belt and Road BRI, is that we also actually invest in businesses and in entrepreneurs, right? So much of what DFC is doing, and this is part of what came over from USAID, which was in the Development Credit Authority, and now the Mission Transaction Unit at DFC, is supporting small businesses and helping to really create that economic underpinning in a society, right, by supporting entrepreneurs. And I hope that's another piece that continues as part of whatever the reimagined pillar would look like.
Yeah, really quickly, I think, MCC provides large-scale grant financing to countries. And I really like this idea of MCC and DFC coming and working closer together. We've been trying for years, but really only worked on the margins. MCC could go in first to some of these countries and invest in projects that the private sector wouldn't, that could facilitate additional private sector-led investment in these countries, whether it's U.S. private sector or other private sector. I mean, that's the whole goal, is to reduce poverty through private sector-led investment. So to me, it makes a lot of sense. Bureaucratically, how you'd manage it all, that's a different question. But I could see that the two together could be more powerful than just each individually.
And I'm working with both U.S. businesses, where U.S. businesses are investing in present, and then working with other, international and or local businesses allows to actually have a much bigger impact. And it helps crowd in U.S. investment, because you're starting to de-risk some of these countries which U.S. investment is much more loath to go in.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to do one last bucket. Please do line up at the mics if you have questions. Paul, I want to start with you on this one. I want to talk about people.
Okay.
Let's talk about people for a moment. So we talked about policy, we talked about process, we talked about possibilities in terms of what it could open up, but let's talk about people, because one of the storylines that we know, both in what has happened over the last 8 weeks with these whole-scale cuts, often the people that are doing this work in the broader sector are invisible to many, to the average American, but to the average person in these communities. You work with a lot of people, Paul, right, in the line of work you do. Tell us a little bit about the people elements of the sector, of the trade industry in the development sector, and then also for students here in this audience. Should they still be passionate about careers in international development? Tell us a little bit about our people here, too, and what they should be thinking about.
And I'm going to do that in under 3 minutes, so yes. So honestly,
2 minutes would be great.
I think one of the greatest aspects of our entire development portfolio is meeting Americans, Americans working overseas with local organizations, bringing that American perspective, which is unique depending on where you are. And that, again, is such an important aspect of our foreign policy on a public diplomacy side, if you will, where I've never met an American, but I worked with so-and-so on a project in my country, and they were just great, and all these aspects and the way that they work, and therefore I assume that all Americans are like this. So hopefully you're a good representative for your country when you go overseas. All of that has been, of course, now dismantled. And the other thing that we forget about is the level of expertise that we have with the local staff of USAID overseas, where we have no idea where they are. Some of these people who have even better perspectives on how to implement development programs, there's been no certainty what's going to happen to them. But now I want to go just from a business perspective on what it's like for American.
Yeah, and I want you to use your NASA analogy that you and I were talking about.
Well, the most important thing to understand is that when you do a contract with the United States government, first of all, it's the taxpayers' money. This is the most important thing that people don't understand, is that it's a taxpayers' money. So Congress is hypersensitive, as you can imagine. And I think that's one of the things that was fascinating that you were mentioning about Republicans creating these infrastructures to spend the American taxpayers' money, but with all these built-in safeguards, not 100%, but pretty darn good. If you haven't seen Andrew Natsios' testimony before the House Foreign Affairs, please do. He will remind you that USAID implementing partners are the most monitored programs out there, and it's that aspect of it. But the problem is when you get the contract, you don't get paid until you submit an invoice. So what you have to do is, as an implementing partner, is you have to go to a lender and say, I have this invoice that I'm going to get paid for. And in the old days, that was as good as gold. Now what we're seeing is a reassessment of the value of that, not just in the international development space, but throughout the federal market space. And this is very damaging as we go forward in our implementation regardless, because you're the bank, I borrow it, I do the work, I give it to the government pays me, I give it back to you, you loan me more money, and I keep the lights on. And this is the cycle of it. But now, all of a sudden, their invoices are not being paid, or they're being paid late. And so the banks are going, well, I'm not going to loan you any more money. So that's why this infrastructure will slowly collapse. It's a little different in the NGO community because a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them work on, you get it in the mail every time, please donate money. So they have a different business model. But in the private sector, that's really one of the big issues that we're facing right now. And there have been lawsuits on this issue. And what we're trying to see with this administration, Article 1 is the legislature and Article 2 is the executive. Will they give that balance of power with it's the courts, the legislature, and the executive? Will they actually listen to the courts, pay the money on that? And lastly, we have to talk about this important, because it's about money, is impoundment and rescission. Will they just take the money back?
Okay.
So many things to talk about. Sorry.
Lots of things to talk about. All right, we're going to take a couple. We'll take Kevin, are you up for a question?
Sure.
Okay, and then Brendan? All right. And then I'm going to come up here next. Okay, go ahead.
I'm going to ask slightly potentially practical questions. I know we talked today a lot about the U.S. perspective on the dismantling of USAID. But I think there has been a running sentiment in recipient countries that this may not be a majority opinion, but some people have claimed that USAID and effects of aid may not be necessarily positive. And, quote, Ugandan President Kagame, that they welcome the change by Trump. So I just want to ask your opinions on, given the fact that USAID may or may not come back, what kind of opportunity presents to recipient countries today, especially in Africa, and I guess in a more multipolar world?
Yeah, and I'll just add on to Kevin's point. We've had conversations with ministers in West Africa, for instance, that are saying this is actually forcing us to think more about self-sufficiency and make the changes that we've been trying to make for a long time. So that sentiment is certainly out there and one that's being actively discussed. Brendan, I'm going to take your question.
Hi, I'm Brendan. I'm an MPP. One student before this, I used to work at PEPFAR, so it's upsetting that
We should have you on stage.
no reauthorization isn't happening. My question is, I feel like with DOGE and the elimination of USAID, a lot of it is a big middle finger to the nonprofit industrial complex. And more than that, it's like powered by this, this American first ideology where we don't value non-American lives. And my question for you is, how do we get MAGA and the right to care about non-American lives again? It used to be with faith-based organizations or private sector groups, but that doesn't seem to be relevant or useful any way to reach the right anymore. So that's my question.
Can I get one more? Are we okay? I'm going to go up here.
Hi there. Oh, God, sorry. I had a very similar question to Brendan because it feels a lot like what you're saying is a communication issue to the American people. So I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on how you would communicate the message of sort of development aid and why it's important to, the average American. Especially, I've been hearing a lot about how, agriculture benefits a lot from the exports that we are putting out there. So yeah, no, that's my question. Thank you.
Great. Okay. 3 different questions. Comms, looking at the nonprofit industrial complex and whether or not we can get back to valuing non-American lives. And then also, are there valid critiques from recipient countries that it's time for a new model? You don't have to answer all 3.
Where to start? So I think the easiest, easiest answer for that for the average American is on diseases and the importance of monitoring, building the health systems overseas so that those diseases don't come to the United States. That's probably a little too abrupt, but that's the most basic. And then,
yeah, I mean, I would actually, I'll build on that and then I'll touch upon the other questions. But look, I don't think it's that we don't have the right messages to reach the American people. I think the American people, first of all, are compassionate, do care about what happens outside the United States, but also don't necessarily get the information that allows them to make the right decisions, right? Like, we develop messages and we put them into these kind of mainstream channels that don't necessarily get people where they live and where they get their information, and in a way that really kind of hits them, where they need to hear it. For the longest time, we were prohibited from propagandizing the American people, right? Like, there were these congressional, strictures.
Smith-Mundt.
Yeah, Smith-Mundt.
For those of
Thank
you
you.
Look it up.
For the longest time, it was like seen as, oh no, you can't message to the American people because, you're messaging to external audiences. And I think we never really got into our mindset when those strictures no longer applied. We never really got into our mindset on how do we build that constituency? How do we explain this at a community level, at a grassroots level, to build that support, right? So we just don't have that infrastructure in our country that allows us to really amplify it. And we're starting to see the impact of that.
So the Army, right? We've all seen commercials for the Army, why you should join the Army. If USAID had spent money on TV ads for the United States, can you imagine what Congress would have done?
I don't even know if it's USAID, but I think, I mean, it's a legitimate conversation, though, that we have to have, which is how do we build that support, amongst the American people. That's one. Because I do think American people care about what happens overseas, but they also are grappling with a lot of issues at home, and you can't, I remember when I was on appropriations and we were passing these large Iraq supplementals to rebuild, after the Gulf War, to build hospitals, and we would have, members of Congress, Democratic members of Congress saying, how can I, get up here and support building a hospital in Iraq when the hospital in my district is crumbling? How do I ask my constituents to pay for this? Right? That's a real tension that we're facing all the time. And we need to think about not making it seem like it's one or the other that is coming, that this is coming at the expense of. And we haven't done a good enough job of explaining that. Just real quick on the first question in terms of...
Did you want to get in on that point?
No, I get 2 other questions, yeah.
Okay, great.
Just on how are recipient governments thinking about it. And look, we've heard for a long time, right, that governments increasingly want to have the conversation on trade and investment. I don't think it's an either or that says, no, we don't want, grant-based assistance, we don't want ODA, we don't want aid. But I think what you've been hearing increasingly from governments, though, is one, wanting more ownership and control, and 2, wanting to move up that, continuum, the development continuum, to creating more private investment, more trade and economic growth opportunities. And you heard about it, last night with Ajay Banga, where he kind of hammered on his focus on jobs, jobs, jobs. That's what people want, and how do you create jobs? I think a lot of what AID has been doing has been trying to move up that. But I think, this is where you hear kind of that tension where governments are saying, okay, fine, you're taking away the aid architecture and we don't want to be aid dependent. So then come to us with then how do you bring in, a different model that maybe focuses on trade and investment?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's the medium to long-term solution. The near-term solution, great. Some of these countries are saying we'll pick this up, but you've got a limited amount of resources, and you've got now 3-4 times the need that you had before. Some of this money was pulled, and so what are you going to do? You're going to invest in education. You're going to invest in health, right? And so you have to address your public financial management challenges. You have to address corruption. So there's an immediate short-term gap here, and it'll be interesting to see what some of these countries decide to do and what they decide to cut. And then I'll just add on one of the questions here is how do we get the right to care about others in other countries? I will say in defense of these cuts recently, they did have a carve out for humanitarian assistance and life-saving support. And the work that we do for USAID is that. We manage a couple of refugee camps and provide bread, but it's not universal. There were other humanitarian assistance programs and life-saving programs in countries that were deemed less strategic or important than the countries where we work that were cut. But there is a recognition, there is a carve-out here for humanitarian assistance, even in this policy proposal.
And I think what's going to be very interesting is, will there be this cutoff list, exactly like you meant, like these countries we don't care about.
Yeah.
We're not going to care about them anymore. We care about these. And how transactional will that relationship be with a revived DFC?
I'm going to try to get in one more question before we come to an end, because you've been patiently waiting.
Thank you. My name is Sabri. I'm a master's in public administration and international development. My question is related to more fragile context countries where USAID was operating. Do you think with keeping just the life-saving activities that USAID will prevent from escalating violence and more conflict happening at local and regional level? And if we see more violence and conflict happening, how do you think that can impact America's interest? Do you think that could result maybe in middle, long-term, more military investment from the US in those regions? Like, what do you think is the impact of more violence resulting from reduced humanitarian assistance? Thank you.
And Wasim, make it really, really short, and then the last word. We'll make this the last word. Wasim, can you speak in the mic?
I'm a research fellow focused on development finance through CID. And in the UK, as we've retrenched from overseas development assistance, we've kind of compensated that with domestic investment by setting up the UK Infrastructure Bank and now turbocharging that with the National Wealth Fund. What I'm wondering is something like that going to happen in the US as well, where there's a lot of poverty and there's a lot of infrastructure gaps? Will the Republican Party also try and channel in funds and development finance domestically?
Okay, so 2 different questions, but also if you just want to, any final thoughts, however you would like to.
So I would just say that on your question, the violence, if all you do is provide humanitarian assistance, that's not going to suppress the violence. The question will be, when does that violence spill over those borders? What kind of regional instability does that create? And then how does that instability impact the United States? And again, if we believe that there's going to be this line, where does that region stand on the line where we care about or don't care about? That's what we don't know. We don't know how it's going to play out. But I personally don't think that's going to be sufficient. I think others would tell you that AID and its implementing partners were trying to create systems where development could actually, international investment would function if you don't have an accounting, if you don't have a good banking system, you don't have transparent laws for investment. No one's going to invest there. It doesn't matter how much money you give them. And I think that was the long-term development goals that I think we're going to realize these are short-sighted cuts, and we're not going to be able to just go in and give a bunch of money, because then it will just be, we run the risk of it just being stolen in the bad old days, as it was.
With respect to kind of the domestic infrastructure finance, et cetera, I mean, first of all, in the Biden administration, you had some very big domestic finance mechanisms through the IRA and the CHIPS Act, which are really focused on first and foremost, the domestic infrastructure space. I think in the current administration, we just had last week, I think, an executive order on critical minerals. And interestingly, one of the things that executive order invoked was the Defense Production Act, which was an authority that in the first Trump administration was used during the pandemic to get DFC to finance PPE and other investments domestically. And the executive order invoked the DPA to look at DFC, to look at critical minerals financing in the United States. So I think there's a thinking. Again, you know, we're not in the current administration and don't have line of sight into how they're trying to align all of this, but I thought it was very interesting that they were kind of reanimating the DPA around critical minerals and using DFC rather than using some of the other authorities that are domestically focused. So let's see where that goes.
Can I use my closing thing to answer a question you asked earlier, and that is, you know, whether folks in this room who are, you know, pursuing degrees in this field should continue to do so? And I would say emphatically yes, because he's going to hire all of you. Yeah, these issues are not going to go away. They're going to be even more complex. Who you can work for and where and how is going to change, has already changed. But we need people who are creative, who have fresh thinking, to come and help resolve some of these issues and support U.S. engagement around the world. So I would encourage you not to abandon this just because of some stuff that has happened with state and USAID, and we'll see how long all of that lasts. The industry per se, and Paul, you could speak to this, both on the for-profit side and on the nonprofit side, it's going to look very different. A lot of organizations have and will go out of business. There will be a lot of consolidation in our sector, so there'll probably be fewer organizations, but organizations that rely on U.S. government funding for the bulk of the work that they do. We do a lot of work with European governments, UN agencies, so there's a lot of work out there. You may just have to think a little bit differently about where to cast your net for a job, but don't give up. If you're mission-driven and you believe in this kind of work, stick with it.
And I would just maybe add one example to illustrate that.
Really fast,
if I can.
time. Yeah.
And that's just social businesses, social impact businesses, right? New business models to try to achieve development goals. I mean, wonderful project, Drink Well, where they're bringing clean drinking water in India and Bangladesh through a business application, but achieving really development objectives. AID supported it and got it started early on, but now it's receiving private financing to scale up. Those are the kinds of opportunities that I think people in this room are going to be ushering in and bringing in a new era.
3 words: be the change. Do it.
I miss working with you, Paul. I just want to, as we close and give our esteemed panel a big round of applause, I just want to say first, I'm very appreciative on behalf of the Harvard Center for International Development. Really want to thank our friends and colleagues at the Institute of Politics. They've hosted us so kindly for the last 2 nights, actually, here at the IOP. We've had really great conversations yesterday with the World Bank and President Ajay Banga, and then today to really dig into both what's happened at USAID, but what could also happen and where this conversation could go. Very fast moving. Let's see where next week takes us in this dialogue. All of these are online. They're live streamed. They're on YouTube, so please do check out the content as part of the series that we're doing on the future of foreign aid. Will you please join me in thanking our distinguished guests for this great conversation?